just find out?
I had known for a while. They called me like a week and a half in advance.
Okay, well,
Yeah, basically. They were like, don't worry, we just want to let you know, but also like, hey, don't tell anyone.
Okay, good.
All right. Yeah, that's good.
So this is Sam's computer sound. Sam's mic. So we just listen. And if you put out a time, you just do the for microphone. But ideally, you don't have to touch anything. You just have to basically do a quick music.
Okay. Yes, I can do that. Yes.
Just in case you need to change the volume in this speaker, you press C. Otherwise, thank you.
Do you like it more?
Yeah.
I give good advice sometimes.
I knew you were right. I'm just like,
You didn't want to accept. You didn't want to accept it.
no, it's more like when I have power for it. I usually don't. Okay, cool.
Hey everyone. Hello. All right. Hey, so for the presentation today, I am going to talk about the work that we shared with you Monday night, the Convoluted Floralitium. So we're going to go through it, kind of some of my motivations, inspirations, conceptions about it, how I made it, how I went about performing it. So just to start off really quick, I'm totally interested in hearing your questions throughout the presentation. We're in kind of a big space, but you know, wave at me if there's something you really want to bring up, and I'm happy to jump into that. I'd love this to be back and forth as possible. Otherwise, I'm very good at just talking for an hour. So, all right. So, just in case there's anyone watching online or out there, my name is Sam Wells, and we're going to be talking about this really large-scale work that I've written over the past year. I'm a musician, trumpeter, composer, and video artist, and I'm an assistant professor of music technology at Temple University in Philadelphia. So first off, before we get into the actual work, I want to jump into some of the general big picture motivations that are behind all the aspects of my artistic practice. One of the first ones of these is the concept of intra-activity that's stipulated by Karen Berard, the quantum physicist and post-humanist scholar. I believe she's UC Santa Cruz. And it's this idea about beings in a relationship or objects in a relationship not being defined in and of themselves, but being defined by the relationship, which means there can't be meaning without multiple bodies in an environment. And this relates to the idea of quantum entanglement in the field of quantum physics. But this is a quote from a wonderful book, Meeting the Universe Halfway, that I'd like to share with you. Meaning is not a property of individual words or groups of words, but an ongoing performance of the world in its differential dance of intelligibility and unintelligibility. So meaning is in a constant state of becoming and emerging. It is an active state, it is a continuous state. Another aesthetic interest of mine is the field of atmosphere aesthetics. And this is focusing on what the feeling of a space is. If you think about the room we're in, sure, we could quantify many little elements of it, but there's an excess of elements that more than we could quantify. And atmosphere aesthetics was, the field was proposed, and the main scholar, this is Gernot Burma, who died, I think, in January of this year. But he talks a lot about the environment, or the relationship between the qualities of the environment and the disposition becoming a central interest of aesthetics. It becomes about the presence of things, of works of arts and animals and human beings being felt as presence on part of the traditional object, and being as feeling of presence as disposition on part of the traditional subject. And this is, to me, very related to this idea of interactivity. The subject and object can't exist without each other, as opposed to a more very traditional view where we only consider the subject or the aesthetics of the object itself. Nothing about the experience of being with the object. So I want to kind of throw those out there just as a quick little appetizer for me talking about the work. But so a lot of what I am interested in is the relationships of beings, people, how they relate to the environment, to the cosmos, to each other, and to music. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the Convoluted Floralitium. So this was written in 2022. And it's a concert-length composition for trumpet, bassoon, drum set, 2 pianos, singing bowls, electronics, and lighting design. So I've been working on this piece I started really conceiving it probably about 14 months ago, but then really began heavily working on it last September. And we gave the premiere performance on March 12th at the California Institute of the Arts. And so first we're going to share a little bit of that performance to refresh the memory of the works. We've been doing a lot here at SPLICE. Or for those who weren't able to be there or didn't see it, just to kind of get a sense of the atmosphere of the work. But one thing that's going to be a continuing theme of this, I'd like to iterate, this was very much for me a collaborative composition. I felt like it was my work and I was the central artist, but in no way, in conception or reality, did it ever exist without my collaborators, who on this premiere performance were Dana Jessen on bassoon, Adam Dixis on drum set, Vicky Ray and Keith Kirchhoff on pianos, who were also the performers last Monday, and the theater director, Joshua Sobel, and the lighting designers, Alejandro Melendez and Stephanie Lutz. So they really not only helped me achieve the performance of the work, but really shaped the conception and challenged me to construct the work into what it became. So let's just start out with a few quick recap. So this is video recording from March 12th. And I'll need to find the time code here. All right, we'll jump to another brief excerpt farther in the work. All right, we'll pause there. So what we saw was just something from the opening of the work, and then right after what I consider to be the climax and high point of the work. This is not an exhaustive sampling of the work, as most of you know from seeing it, but I just wanted to kind of get us in the mindset of the work. So the first thing I'd really like to talk about with this work are some of my inspirations, what I was thinking about very early on in the compositional process and before the compositional process. And I was reading this book by Ben Ehrenreich called Desert Notebooks, A Roadmap for the End of Time. And this is a sort of half memoir, half travelogue. I think Ehrenreich is a really wonderful writer, very clear, personal, and simultaneously it's a very intimate writing style, discussing very grand issues. And the book is mainly examining the unprecedented pace of destruction to our environment and the increasingly unstable geopolitical landscapes. And it's all through while he's kind of traveling around the desert and then working in Las Vegas for a while and then maybe hiking and then writing about other geopolitical issues, all in the scope of like an owl that he saw fly by. But there's a couple ideas in the book that were really interesting to me. The first off, there was kind of a constant examination of creation myths or scientific inquiry as a way to present different perspectives, how we can understand what's going on. And it was all not trying to find like the seed of truth of what's going on, but just to like examine that we can change our perspective on these things, or we can recontextualize our experiences. And one of these was starting to deal with cyclical notions of time. A lot of our experiences of time and the way we culturally and spiritually talk about time have to treat time as a linear arrow. And then when we view time cyclically, things return. So that's one thing that really interested me. And the other was, at least I was personally feeling, it was expressed in the book, that time seems to be continually accelerating. Just things seem to go by faster, and there's many different ways we can examine this, but like whether it's in political events, or we're just busy, or the older we get, the more quickly time feels to go by. And all of these kind of lead towards this idea that I wanted to look at how we try to find perspective beyond our perceptual experiences. And my argument in this piece is that pretty much almost everything we do is an attempt to find some sort of perspective that we can't actually perceive, whether it's religious or spiritual or scientific. These are all things we can't readily perceive in our like moment of being, and then we're trying to find ways and to get a different perspective on a reality to better understand our place. So I'll read you one quick quote from the book. The entirety of existence was a text waiting to be read, which means there could be no line between the reader and the written. You who are reading this, you too are written, you too can be read. And I, a writer, am already written through and through. Everything between us, everything that separates us, mountains, stars, years, shimmering thoughts and dreams that die with waking, all of it is a single chain of signs that do not point to another reality, only to this one all at once. To me, this kind of gets at this idea of we're trying to find a new perspective on what we perceive and our experience, but this is inescapable. We cannot leave our own experience, our own state of being. And also that we are in a constant state of writing and being read. Things are constantly being created and destroyed. And everything is, in that way, is in the present tense, and it's an active action. So that's kind of the, there's a lot I want to talk about in the work, so I'm just going to drop all of these concepts in really quick. So this is where I was at when I started to write the work. Kind of how do we collect all of these perspectives? What does it mean that we're trying to find these different perspectives on reality? Wonderful. So I'd like to actually dive into a little bit about my approach with the composition itself. So first, there's kind of three areas I want to talk about in terms of composing. We'll talk about how there's a lot of really important structural elements and structural plans in this work. We'll talk about my approach to those and how they relate to the themes previously discussed, the tonal language and harmonic language that I was using, and the balance of improvised and notated music. After that, we'll talk about the more performative elements, how we approach improvisation as performers, how we were integrating electronics into the performance, and the theatrical elements. So with the structure, I started out I knew I had to write this work. I had to write a big work. Wasn't sure what I wanted to do. And I knew I wanted it to be a single massive experience. But so I don't know, an hour long or something, but at least for me as a composer, sitting down and trying to write an hour of music is pretty terrifying. So basically how I approach this composition or any other ones, I try to figure out some sort of structure, which for me is just chunks of time and how I'm dividing that up. I decided to break it into 12 units. And this was based on not based on, but because there are 12 astrological signs. It's sort of a mythological area we look for meaning to gain understanding on our reality. So I chose the number 12. So it's effectively arbitrary, where it came from. And I knew the total duration needed to be about 60 plus minutes. So this is kind of what I knew going in. So what we're going to see as we build up this structure is that there are 12 movements. And what these movements represent are these kind of active present states. We'll look at the movement titles again, but you may recall that they were all present participles. Words like accreting or being or returning. It's all in an active, continuous state of being. These movements are packaged into larger parts. So it's kind of a nested form, and where these parts are more about our mythological understandings. And the titles had to do with constellations or asterisms or mythological natural phenomena. And then finally, the title of the work, which is the Convoluted Floralitium, is, for me, kind of the return to the terrestrial. So I want to talk a little bit about the title. So a floralitium is a literary tradition out of the commonplacing tradition. It's an anthology of a variety, it could be of a variety of different things. It's either patristic religious teachings or secular literary writings or like formulas, or quite literally what the name represents, it was a anatomically correct collection of flower drawings originally. But so what this kind of became to represent to me is it's a collection of perspectives, ideas, or approaches on how we can relate to our experience of reality and what we imagine reality can be. The cottonwood tree is widely present in the North American landscape, as you might know, and it appears in numerous myths of indigenous peoples to the continent. And I personally grew up around these trees, so they become like a marker for home, and I don't live them anymore, so when I go home I see the cottonwood trees. And for me, it is kind of a grounding, representational object. So personally, it represents where I'm from, but it also represents living on this earth to me. And I also think the seeds, I forget, there's a very specific term where they release the fluffy seeds into the air, and the light hits it just right, it looks like stars, even when it's like very bright outside. And that relates to kind of this recurring theme of constellations and asterisms. All right, so I kind of knew I wanted to do that, and I knew I was going to have 12 units, and I knew I wanted it to feel like it was speeding up. So I love a lot of times having to make less decisions or finding a simple way to make a decision as a composer. Otherwise, I just kind of sit around and wait. So I used a sinusoidal equation to determine my form. And I knew it had to be about 20 minutes or an hour long, and I was working with the sine equation. So the piece was technically planned to be 20 pi minutes long. It's longer than that. So one caveat, when I work like this knowing that when it gets down to the actual making music part, I don't care about this anymore. And if something's a minute longer because that's right, then that's what it is. This is all for me to create, and basically it creates like a scaffolding that allows me to be creative. And then when the object exists, the scaffolding can be removed, and if the scaffolding doesn't quite relate anymore. So anyway, this seems pretty intense compared to maybe what you heard. And that's kind of where the difference comes from. But basically, this is a sine wave, and because m, which is minutes on the top equation, is squared, the period or frequency of this oscillation is increasing throughout time. And this has 6 full oscillations, and I use the 0 crossings to determine when each movement would end. The equation on the bottom is you could put in like movement 1, and I would say the number of minutes, how far we're into the piece. And what I ended up with this graph. And so you can see we have the 5 parts on the left and the 12 movements on the right. And this was also an experiment. I was curious to see if we could get an accelerating sense of time. And that's something I'm honestly interested in talking to all of you about. I don't know if I did achieve that or not, because it became less important the farther I got into the work. But it did provide this structure that I have ended up being quite happy with how it turned out. But so we can see our movements on the right, the start-stop times, and the durations, and then how they're grouped into the 5 parts. The 5 parts I grouped arbitrarily with what seemed like would feel right as I experimented with the durations. And more or less, they do decrease in duration, but more or less what felt like equal-ish parts, or formally balanceable parts. And what we ended up with was this list of movements. So I was going to talk through kind of aesthetically what I was going for in each one, but the first movement is the first part. And the first part was called Winter Circle. And so the winter circle is an asterism in the northern hemisphere, winter sky. So an asterism is basically a constellation that's not a constellation. It's a recognizable shape that we can make out of stars, but it is not like the Big Dipper. It is not an official approved constellation. So the winter circle appears in a variety of different myths, including in Lakota mythology, from the present-day Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota regions in the Black Hills, and which represents the Chantaleska Wakan, which is the sacred hoop, which was part of the creation origin story of Lakota mythology. It represented the Great Race, which was one of the creation stories. And then so this entire first movement to me was about world building. As we'll discuss in a little bit, I was really bringing this work to life as kind of it relies heavily on the performers through improvisation. I would never say it's ever truly what I would call free improvisation, but there are incredibly open moments for the performer. And one of the reasons it is not, I would say, free improvisation is because this first movement is quite restricted, and we spend about 18, kind of ends up being almost like 23 minutes. Like we really stretch it out. And it provides a huge amount of momentum to the work in a very specific direction. For me, there's no way that what starts this work, this kind of massive musical object, there's no way that it doesn't affect what comes after it for a very, very long time. So that was something I was really going for with this first movement. The second part, Tramontana. Tramontana is a mythological or a supernatural North Mediterranean wind that drives people crazy. It's called a variety of different things, but particularly these myths seem to be like in the Catalan region of Spain. This movement was mainly about kind of these icy, challenging sounds, this fragility, and this questioning. And we'll kind of revisit the score as we go through this presentation. Part C, Vela, were 3 movements where there was no indication for the performers besides to play with the electronics or against the electronics. It was completely open. But by about this point, we were 32 minutes into the work. There was a lot of history already of the work that's going to shape how the performers improvise. And then part D, Orologium. Oh, and one thing I almost forgot to mention, this work in kind of a very, I think, predictable sense represents a kind of stereotypical life cycle. There's an origin, there's a creation, there's a building, which is part A. There's a questioning or a challenging, which is part B. Then there's like a leaving or fixing or grappling with or discovery in part C. And then part D, Orologium. Oh, sorry, part C, Vela. It's a constellation, it's the sails of, it's in the southern hemisphere. To me, it represents travel, the ocean, leaving. Part D, Orologium, is a pendulum clock constellation, which represents how we try to use logic to understand our existence and quantify time or our experiences. And Orologium represents some of the most composed music in the work in two ways. One, we have fully notated scores, and we also had complete restriction where there's a movement where none of the humans played, and it's just electronics. And then Noctua is an asterism of an owl. An owl can represent night or kind of learning or wisdom. And as the work winds down in kind of the erosion or revealing or the destruction or death of the work, that kind of represents the narrative part of the work. Excellent. So this is how these subject matters came through grappling with the form and the constraints I put upon myself. They slowly started to materialize over time. So this final movement, structure, subject matter, and organization happened closer to the end of the work, while this was a very early on scaffolding for me to work within. All right, so the next thing I wanted to discuss was the tonal language and harmonic language I use within the work. So the Convoluted Floralitium often utilizes a just intonation tuning system that is centered around D flat. So again, like I sometimes can never make a decision when I compose, and I didn't know what pitch to tune it around. So technically, the duration of the work, that is the period of the frequency 2.26 times 10 to the negative fourth, which is technically a D flat. It's D flat negative 16. To me, this is just arbitrary, but it worked for me, so I chose D flat. But this, I'm going to show some of the notation and just intonation practice I'm using. I just wanted to mention that I'm using the Helmholtz-Ellis just intonation pitch notation system developed by Mark Sabat and Wolfgang von Scheinitz. And it's used to indicate in a more traditional Western notational setting microtonal deviations that align with harmonic series and subharmonic series. Mark and Wolfgang developed this along with Kat Lamb, Thomas Nicholson, and SPLICE alum Mo Abbott. And when I'm writing specific pitches, the work is incredibly restricted. Again, we'll kind of get to this in a little bit with the balance of improvisation or unpredictability with predictability. I wanted senses of return, I wanted senses of organization, and I also didn't want to overly limit the improvisers. So when I'm writing clear pitches and harmonies, I was being very limited, and these were these moments of harmonic return. I wouldn't know where everyone was going to go, but I knew we would come back here. so I could calculate, how the work in a bigger, in a macro sense would like cadence harmonically, even though if I wouldn't know specifically what the tension would be. For those who aren't familiar with just intonation, there's many different approaches, but the approach I'm using is basically focused on simple integer ratios, as provided by the harmonic series, and this is my tuning lattice as expressed in fractions. So you can see we have a 1-1 there, so if we have a pitch at a ratio of 1 to 1, that's the same pitch. And I'll show this notated here in a second too. But if we go up or down, if we go up, following those red lines, that is going up by a ratio of 3/2, which is a justly tuned perfect fifth, which is about, if there's anyone who plays a non-equal tempered instrument, oftentimes you'll play a perfect fifth just the tiniest bit sharp because it sounds better. And then, you'll see if you go up, it's basically multiplying each number by 3/2 or 1.5. If you go down, it's multiplying it by 2/3. The blue left to right, if you go to the right, from 1/1 we go to 7/6, and that is a very narrow minor third, which is called a septimal minor third between the 7th overtone and the 6th overtone, and it's that minor third going down the other way. And then the green sort of kind of going in and out, what I was trying to do, going backwards is up a major third, a 5/3 major third, or going down, the inverse of that, 4/5. So I chose these intervals and this lattice. I tried many different things, but this was purely the pitch and interval content that I was attracted to and enjoyed at the time. So there's no kind of deeper choice behind these, but I chose a couple harmonies, and then I used this lattice structure to extend out what I liked to find additional things that were related to it. And it provided me kind of ways to transpose through the lattice, or to find kind of more complex harmonies that existed within my structure. Here we can see that same pitch structure, but using the Helmholtz-Ellis just intonation tuning system. This is pretty small, but nope, I don't know where the mouse is. But okay, so we see the D flat right here. All right, so that's a D flat. And if we go up to the right a little bit, to right here, we see an F flat. So that's a minor third up, but it has that kind of upside down 7 on it. So that indicates it would be what we'd call a septimal comma, or it's lower like it were the 7th overtone, which is, depends, but it's about 29 cents a lot of times. So it's pretty flat. But all of these ratios are related in very simple ways, and there's very much a sweet spot in which they resonate. And then, let's see. The other thing, so when you see the kind of 7 that's not upside down, that's going upwards by the same deviation. And when you see, it's hard to see, but it looks like a little barb, but it's just the arrow going up on some of the flats, or down on the naturals and flats. That's about 14 cents, and that's the major third syntonic comma. But it's about 14 cents, and then so that's, if we're playing major thirds compared to equal temperament, we can only bring them down a little bit to the really sweet, beautiful spot of resonance. So all of this is based off of fifths and major thirds, and then narrow minor thirds. Which, as we all know, we can make a lot out of minor thirds, major thirds, and fifths. But these are kind of brought the work into, I think, a more unique strange sound that also felt settled in a lot of ways, because it ultimately, at the heart of it, there are some simple ratios. So in the opening movement, there was actual bowed piano, you may remember, but there's also extensive use of bowed piano samples that I processed and detuned. So I believe Vicky was the first person to bow the piano, and she's bowing the piano, then emerges out of that pre-recorded bowed piano samples. So in the piano, the sound originates and then emerges out of this kind of, unless we were to retune the piano, an impossible pitches that are not on the instrument, and kind of extends out into this structure. So here we can see a brief excerpt from the score, kind of the climax of this when I had many of these samples going, and we can see another example of this notation. And I'll play back a quick example of this sound. Okay, so there was a really heavy drone element. We'll look at that part of the score too in a little bit, but the electronics were just kind of providing this pad, this universe with its own logic. Part of this world-building approach I like to think about a lot is not only are you, well, we can describe it in a couple different ways, but like you're kind of like setting up the vibe for the work and like what it's generally going to feel like. But what I think more interesting to think about is setting up what logic exists in the work. We talk about logic in reality, and like there's a whole field about logic, like if we do this, then that, and all of those things. But I think we can create musical works that, without stipulating necessarily in a score, provide instruction and answers to questions. All right? Also, as a composer, that is relinquishing a lot of control to a performer, which I'm personally okay with. But this idea that there are things that make sense in this piece and there are things that don't. All right? And so it's really interesting to think about as a composer and really interesting to think about as a performer. What is the work telling you to do? And that kind of decision-making, I think, is developed through just experience of working with sound, improvising with sound, and composing for sound. Okay, here's another example of this just intonation tuning system. This was the second excerpt I showed earlier, where the only just intonation or microtonal deviation I'm able to do is on the trumpet and the bassoon, because the pianos are at equal temperament, so it kind of raises this question, how do we deal with that? So I kind of made a rule. One, we're improvising and playing really, really hard and aggressively for like 55 minutes by this point. The pianos weren't going to be perfectly in tune. Like that's fine. But so like I was kind of like, all right, and even if they're out of tune, that's fine. But what I limited myself to were the pitches in the harmonic series of D flat, or some of the other pitches in the lattice that were within like 5 cents of equal temperament. I kind of said close enough. So basically, we get a lot of like B flat, G flat, A flat, E flat, D flat. But then also, to kind of give it the sound of just intonation, there are other like super high overtones that are really close to equal temperament, like the 17th partial, which is like almost an equal tempered half step above the 16th partial, which is the 4 octaves up from the fundamental, and the 19th partial. So basically we're kind of in like a D flat world, and I sprinkled in some high Ds and high Fs to give it kind of a little bit of that bend. And also, when you're limited to this amount of pitch material, I was looking for something a little bit more harmonically complex. But that puts kind of all the onus of just intonation-ish stuff on two wind instruments. So we can see here I've also written in, this is something I'll often do, the deviations from equal temperament. So like a lot of times, you know, it's just a bummer, like, to say, okay, that's a weird, on the third bar in the bassoon, we have an F flat that's lowered, so it's like a super low F flat, and it just makes sense to write that as an E natural down, basically a third tone. And so doing that, you can kind of bridge the gap with this. All right, so there's one more example of this, and this was in movement 7, following the big, more or less free improvisation section. It's the beginning of part D, Orologium, and this movement is called retending, like retention, remembering, or holding on to. And this was, I was thinking about kind of the Husserlian concept of time, where retention is our immediate memory of like kind of like the active locus of time perception. And I was more kind of experiencing or thinking about this as the active remembering of this free, quote unquote, free improvisation journey that the group just went on. So this is a moment in the score. For about 7 minutes, the entire ensemble was tacit. And I go through a justly tuned chord progression with glissandi, and then to further reinforce the harmonic series that I was working with, I have delays on the synthesizers that I used to create this, with incredibly low delay times. So it's basically starting to get a comb filtering effect at some moments. But there were, I don't have written down here, but specific pitches, probably a D flat, that would basically at some moments really begin to resonate with this kind of journey of the synth underneath it. So I'll play a little bit of it here. Yeah, and can you hear the beating that happens? So those are the different tones with the different frequencies interacting. And then you have those moments where you kind of have that almost feedback sound that happened at the beginning. That was the delay line where the frequency of the synthesizers was really starting to match up with the delay time. We had a huge amount of constructive interference that just started to blossom. So that is kind of, in a nutshell, how I was dealing with pitch as a way to add moments of clarity and identity to the work. So along those lines, I knew I wanted to write a work. So I wrote the work for the ensemble. First off, because it was just kind of like a dream team for me. I was super excited about it. I was like, this band is going to be amazing. Second off, it's a pretty big work that's probably not going to get performed a lot. It's a little impractical. I knew we were going to be able to do it here, and I knew we were going to be able to do it in California. And just the idea to do something impractical and do it twice sounded awesome. So that's why I started to do that. But more back to kind of like dream team thing, I knew this was a band that was going to improvise really well together. I knew everyone in the group, I knew their styles, and I also just musically and artistically trusted them to come into a situation and put together a huge amount of music very, very quickly, try to work with me and kind of help execute and develop the vision, but also make up for my shortcomings. Sometimes as a composer, if I didn't take care of this, they're like, okay, no, something needs to happen, let's do it. But, so, there's this central problem that I was very concerned about early on. Improvisation was important for practical reasons, aesthetic reasons, and just out of like what I was interested in. But equally important was I was writing a specific work that wanted to be that work, recognizable as that work, and unique to itself, and sounded like itself on repeat performances. So I wanted it to be open, but it couldn't be completely open. So there are a couple different ways I approach this. We'll look at some notation, but the first one I want to go back to is that first movement. I've used this analogy a lot to describe the work. The work feels like one of those massive like oil tankers or cargo ships, right? You know, and they like, I don't know if you've heard, I think they take like 8 miles to stop. To like if they're going along, and they don't go very fast, but once they slow down, it just takes miles and miles. They're so huge, they're in the water, there's so much inertia. All I wanted the first movement to do was take this band, which is 2 pianos, drum set, trumpet. It's a big group with electronics. It's making a lot of sound, and I just wanted to like kind of turn it 10 degrees to the left, just kind of push it in that direction and give it some momentum and inertia that we're going to end up generally in that direction, and then let it go. That's kind of how I felt about that. And then later on, I also have like an off-ramp from all the improvisation where I bring everyone back down again. So I'm just going to show some of the ways I did that. But the improvisations are guided primarily through musical context and aesthetic descriptors. Occasionally, we have rhythmic and pitch material to further restrict the improvisation. So this is kind of the first moment of instrumental improvisation, or on our normal instruments, aren't the bowls. It was for Dana and myself, and I wrote a quote-unquote melody. It was a series of pitches that we're going to improvise around. What does around mean? I don't know. I wanted to leave that part open. I wanted someone to take this. But then right in the middle, I say pseudo-synchronous long tones with bassoon or with trumpet. I wanted the trumpet to be doing something, and then we kind of align and go off together. The other part about this work, and I think with my music, everything is intuitive in 2 ways. One, the way I compose is quite intuitive, but I think I know that I want, when you're listening to it, it makes sense in and of itself. I never wanted the bassoon to drop in and not fit in. So an overarching guideline is do what makes sense to you within the context of the work. So this is kind of one example of the way I notated it. And then later on in this big build, which Adam called, I think, the longest drum fill of all time or something, basically the drums and the 2 pianos are playing on the same rhythmic grid. And I asked them to play basically 8th note or 16th note rhythms and just stay in time with each other. And I limit the rhythmic. So here the pianos are very limited. They can only play E flat for piano 1 and D flat for piano 2. The plus sign there means add in that rhythmic cell as an option. It's not muted. And then as we're starting to do a slow build, this kind of builds up towards constant 16th notes for the big crescendo, and they're limited to constant 16th notes at this point. They can only be doing 16th notes. It's this big repeated 16th notes, and then we get to our final build there. During this time, it's on this page, but trumpet and bassoon were given pitches of overtones of like the relationships from all those both piano things, or the option to hear a pitch and play it, or pull a pitch from something. So it's very open, but with kind of the instruction that you are like amplifying an overtone from the texture that's going on. And 2 more kind of quick examples of this notation. I mentioned this part C vela. That was that big open section. And so this is about 15 minutes of the piece, this page. And it's 3 movements all on one page. And I just have spectrograms there to indicate what's going on, and with the instruction of play against, with, against, or beyond the electronics. I have no idea what playing beyond the electronics means, but I like the idea of it. Also, more to the point with that, I think it's kind of a prompt to the improviser to engage with whatever musical space they are currently drawn towards, and how can they work with that, and how can they can choose how they are relating, whether it's in conflict with the electronics or not, or in relation at all. Then there's a movement that was no electronics, and I just wrote free. That was the moment that is quote unquote free improv, but we're 36 minutes into the piece. There was a lot of history that I don't think could be ignored. And then this is the moment I call the off ramp. That's 40 minutes. It's very soft electronics for about 5 minutes. I believe the way we were playing on Monday at that moment, there was no way that anyone heard anything, which was kind of the point. And then it slowly emerges and slowly overtakes it. So if a musician is playing and being sensitive to what's going on, they will react to that, it will pull them along with that. This led into that big tacit low synth drum. And also we knew the timestamp at the end of the system, and we knew the time that we're building to. I'll talk a little bit about chordation here, I think just a second. And then finally, towards the end, we all had a similar melodic gesture. Okay, so we've been going about 55 minutes. I can really quickly talk about some of the electronics and staging things. We can open it up to questions. Up to you. Going once. Yeah, question?
Yeah, I was just curious because you said you had this performed twice now.
Yeah.
So, was there any significant differences that you noticed, especially in the improvisation between the two performances?
I'm really happy with both performances, but the improvisation on Monday was pretty awesome. I think the world of the piece, everyone's more comfortable relaxing into it and doing a little bit less. But I think that would come with repeat performances on about anything. But in terms of aesthetically what we did, there were certainly changes. We're also in a very different room. We talked about in rehearsal, I had a few notes the other space we were in was maybe about half the size of this room. It's very, very small. And so I think sometimes there had to be a little bit more energy here to kind of get the energy to the back of the hall, or a little bit more put into it. Yeah?
Can you talk about, you worked with staging, or there were people consulting?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me jump ahead to that real quick. So the whole, basically this was meant to be an experience. I wanted to make a singular event happen. And to me, it truly is a concert. It was just a concert experience. And I wanted to investigate what we could do to highlight the work, to amplify the themes in the work, to kind of increase the connection with the audience. This isn't a theater piece, but at least to me, but there are theatrical elements to it. So originally, in terms of collaboration, at CalArts, I worked with 2 lighting designers and a theater director. So the way this worked was that they were like, "This is your thing," and I would talk to them, but they would sit and listen, and then they would just kind of try to interpret it through their theatrical lens. So basically, I mean, this is why I think we should a huge benefit to collaborating, especially with people who work in different media or different disciplines. It's like they take this and they say something you would never ever think of. All right, so just having someone to kind of chew on what you're doing and spit it back to you from a different angle totally kind of reinforced and made me question my work in a whole different ways. So the way it worked with the Josh Sobel, who has mainly worked with me for about 8 months on it, we'd meet once a month and just talk about what's going on. And he's like, okay, what you're saying there doesn't make sense to me. Explain it better. And then I'd find out that I didn't have a good idea, something like that. But the lighting designer was really interested in exploring these ideas of kind of contraction and expansion, and like building off of concentric circles, kind of these ideas of cycles and nested stories. So this idea of having the globe lights and bringing them with us, it ends up being a very simple gesture. One, there's kind of like the surfacey like constellation and adds depth and perspective to the space, which I really like aesthetically. But there's this very simple gesture that's central to it, is that we all bring up the lights, we bring them into the center, and then they kind of expand out with us. And then we leave without them. And there's many different ways to interpret that, and I leave that open. But for me, it was like, also just like with music, we're like, okay, no, like, how many channels is it, or like, you know, like get into the nitty-gritty on that delay line, or like whatever's going on, right? And then have someone be like, yeah, but what's it about? And they're like, oh yeah, okay. And then like to having to keep dig deeper on the themes that you like and articulate them, and then question how the construction and execution is related to that. Cool, yeah.
You kind of touched on this a little bit at the beginning, but you were talking about the concept, you know, writing an hour-long piece being terrifying for composers who also might be writing something that is longer and terrifying. Like, how did you work through like those feelings of intimidation as you were writing this?
I did it twice. I wrote 2 pieces. No. Well, okay, so there's a couple different, like, for me, like, fears that I feel as a performer and composer. More acutely as a composer. Most acutely when I'm performing my own work. It's quite terrifying. Because there's just no excuse. One is related to just like, you know, like just kind of the fear that people won't like it or won't like the experience or be very judgmental of it, which is something I think we're all dealing with in music constantly. And, well, honestly, the biggest way I did that was I tried to stop being judgmental of other things, but still be critical. To me, critique is super positive. Judgment is maybe seems more arbitrary. The other thing, though, is to more deeply engage with being in the moment of the work and spending time with it. You can do this through composition, improvisation, and most importantly, listening to other large-scale works and what you want to like emulate with that, whether this is as a performer or a composer. And for me, to more enjoy a large-scale work, the more I have to be in the moment performing and listening. Like the longer it gets, the more in the now I have to be. Because otherwise, if you are not present, you're missing kind of the flow of time in the work. And this is true in any length of work. But if you're not engaged with the work, I think it can, when works become a certain length, it's about, I think, it being an experience. And if you're not experiencing it, you are missing the work entirely. So I'm not sure if that's quite super helpful, but
It is, thank you.
yeah. Yeah.
I was really intrigued when you talked about logic and
Mhm.
how you were exploring them. Just like posing questions and then answering some questions. It makes me think about like how we like think about constructing useful phrases where we have an antecedent, a consequent, a question, answer. There's a relationship in that, and it made me think about how you were talking about relationships at the beginning of your talk, and I wanted to ask, how did thinking about musical logic inform how you explored the relationships that you were thinking about in the piece?
That's a really interesting question. So I think with logic, I think the whole idea for me about logic is that there's some sort of system or algorithm. You have an input and something comes out, right? But the system in this case is the individual identity of the performer or the composer. And it's not a simple system, and it's a system that's in constant flux. And it's a system that you can shape yourself through experience, through listening, through performance, study, all the things, right? And in terms of the relationship of it, I can only more really speak to, so in terms of composition, that was the idea that this exists. And that I tried to make sounds that made sense to me, sense being logical in the context of the work. Then as a performer, I could only react to that plus everything else, plus what I put into it in real time. And then in terms of relations, I hope everyone else is also listening and reacting, which I knew was going to happen based on the musicians that I sent. But I think this idea that we are complex systems that can have logics and that music or artwork can have logic is really interesting, but it eventually gets into kind of like a black box idea. You don't really know what's going on inside, but you can shape the processes through its inputs. Yeah?
You thought, as you explained for your presentation, you thought very deeply about what the work means to you, what sort of philosophical ideas you're going off of as you're writing, the structure of the work, the titles of the title of the piece itself. And sort of my question pertains to this, which is something that I've been thinking about, is if someone, we have the program notes, all when we were going to the concert, we have the title of the piece when we go to the concert and all of that. So I feel like in sort of a more theoretical situation of this is let's say someone comes to, or is in the musical space where your piece is happening, sort of sight unseen of the title of the piece, you're relaying to us of what this word means to you and your thoughts behind the piece. How do you as a composer sort of tackle the sort of extra musical ideas that inform the music versus how do you think that will impact someone's experience and listening and reckoning with the piece?
So, I mean, basically addressing, guiding a listener's experience through extra musical content to make sure it aligns with what my goals were. So first off, I didn't have program notes at the first performance. I should have, but I didn't. But basically, and it's a big question, and we're about out of time, but basically, I'm not super concerned about it aligning with my vision. I think it probably will to some degree, and it's also kind of part of the vision, right? But I'm not particularly concerned because there's a sense of narrative in my work, I believe, but it is so highly abstracted. It's not like today it was sunny and then I went to the store and bought some bread, right? It's not clear, and nor do I want it to be, which means it's interpreted and read by the person listening to it, and there's space for that. The program notes provide some guidance, but also at the end of the day, maybe not that much. It's just more kind of about motivations and reference points. But I'm okay with people having their own experience, and all you can do is hope that it's a meaningful one for them. Anyways, we do have to wrap it up. Thank you all for your questions and for listening.